Thank you all for being here today. It is an honor and it is a privilege for me to introduce Robert Whitaker to you. I'm Kleoniki Yannakopoulou. If it sounds Greek, don't worry, it is Greek. So this is why people call me Cleo. I'm a psychologist, founder of Anima NGO in Athens, Greece. And actually, Bob, you were my inspiration every time I got tired of supporting people who withdraw. So it is a special honor for me to introduce you today. So Robert Whitaker, for those who don't know, I don't know if there are any in the audience, is the founder of madinamerica.com. He's an author of 4 books, and he also co-authored the 5th, 3 of which tell the history of psychiatry. In 2010, Anatomy of an Epidemic, Magic Bullets, Psychiatric Drugs, and the Astonishing Rise of Mental Illness won the US Investigative Reporters and Editors Book Award. And Mad in America in 2002 was named by Discover Magazine as one of the best science books of the year. He's an American journalist. And Robert, what's wrong with psychiatric drugs?
Okay, well, thanks, Cleo. First of all, it's just a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank John and Lucy and the board of IIPDW for making this happen, Ador and Rex. It takes a lot of work, but I think it's so important. I was just saying to Cleo beforehand, I so wish this was in person, because so much of a conference is getting a chance to be with people in between sessions and all. So hopefully next time. Real quickly, Cleo mentioned who I am and how I came to this. I came at this whole topic from an outsider's point of view, a journalist's point of view. And as John mentioned in the beginning, I was involved in helping IIPW get started. And the reason was, it's so clear that drug withdrawal can be a path to a better life, a new life. And yet there was nothing research, there was very little research being done on how to do that well, very little support. So one of the purposes was really to see, to help create an institution that could show that this is an opportunity and a way forward. So my talk is titled, What's Wrong with Psychiatric Drugs? But really, I just want to say, what you'll see in this talk is an opportunity that can come with drug withdrawal. So when you hear this title, it sounds so negative, but it's also about possibility for charting a new path in life. So I'm going to share my screen, and I hope this will work. I hope that everybody sees that now. Does that Cleo show up?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So real quickly, if you look at the problems with psychiatric drugs, there's really, you can bring them in a sort of 3 parts. One, of course, is there was a time we were being told that psychiatric drugs fix chemical imbalances in the brain as if they were an antidote to a known pathology. You know, that, however, was a marketing story. It wasn't a scientific story. And if you really dig into the science, what you find is that research hasn't identified any pathology for these major disorders. And what you're doing with psychiatric drugs is perturbing normal function. And we'll go into that. So you're abnormalizing brain function. And once you understand that, you can see why drugs may be problematic, particularly over the long term. And you can, once you understand the mechanism of action, you can also understand why withdrawal can be such a problem. The second part is this. You know, we test drugs basically funded by pharmaceutical companies for their short-term efficacy in reducing symptoms. And not as much attention is focused on, well, what happens to people over the long term? How does it shape their lives? And does it, you know, the hope or the expectation is that the medication will improve people's lives over the long term, their functioning, their symptomatology, et cetera, that their lives will be better because of the medical treatment. But what happens when you look at the long-term outcomes is, in fact, what you find over and over again, and this was with every class of drugs major class of drugs, with the antipsychotics, the antidepressants, the benzodiazepines, and the stimulants to an extent as well, you see actually over the long term that this long-term use of the medications increases the chronicity of symptoms. increases the likelihood of functional impairment, and actually increases the likelihood you'll move from a milder diagnosis to a more severe diagnosis. Now, the third part is, and this is sort of one of the unfortunate parts, or one of the challenges with coming off, is because your brain adapts to the presence of the drug, withdrawal can be very difficult. And unfortunately, and we haven't done much research on sort of what does happen really to the brain when you go off the drugs, and what is the path towards sort of renormalization. So those are the three things we're going to look at in the next half hour, the research that sort of fleshes this out. But I do want to frame it in this way. One of the things in Mad in America is you can read a lot of personal stories about people who, many people even after years and years on the medications, who finally were able to get off. And we're talking about antidepressants, benzodiazepines, antipsychotics, not any particular class of drugs. And what you hear in their stories, in these lives, over and over again, is how they feel they got a full life back, of being able to fully feel the world again, to think more clearly. And they'll see it as a defining moment in their life, when their life took off down a new path, a better path in life. And that's the opportunity here. And you'll see it in the research literature. It shows up in the research literature, shows up in personal accounts. You're going to hear from, I think, Laura Delano later today. She can talk about this path as well. And I just want to frame this talk in this way. There is an opportunity here that IIPW is trying to create for people who've gone on these medications and want to get off. So real quickly, I just took a couple graphics from a textbook. So this is just showing how neurons in the brain normally communicate and along neurotransmitter pathways. The dopamine pathway is one of the major pathways in the brain. And what you have is you have a presynaptic neuron that releases a molecule, which we call a neurotransmitter, into the synaptic cleft. And that binds with receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. And that's how neurons communicate in the brain. It's very simple. You release the neurotransmitter, it goes into this gap. And then, by the way, it has to be taken back up into the presynaptic neuron or removed from that gap in a very quick function. That's how it is. It's a burst, and then it's removed from the gap. Now, what happens if you go on an antipsychotic? Well, what an antipsychotic does is it blocks the receptors. It's like you pour glue into the dopamine receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, and that prevents this message from going across this dopamine pathway. And you'll see what happens. But the brain, being this incredibly having this incredible neuroplasticity and all these feedback mechanisms, as soon as you go on an antipsychotic, it says, uh-oh, you're blocking my normal function along these pathways, and I got to try to compensate for this drug presence. And the immediate response is this. The presynaptic neuron will actually try to put out more dopamine than normal for a while, because you're acting as the drug acts as a brake on dopamine transmission. And then the postsynaptic neuron will increase the density of its receptors for that molecule. And this is a graphic showing the way the brain is changed by the presence of the drug. And we'll get to this in just a second, but this is a way to understand how drugs work on the brain. They perturb some normal functioning, and then your brain goes through an adaptation process to try to compensate for that interruption in normal functioning. And researchers say the brain is trying to maintain a homeostatic equilibrium, maintain its normal functioning. Real quickly with the antidepressants. So dopamine, antipsychotics act to block normal transmission, block the effect of the neurotransmitter. With an antidepressant, so what happens with an antidepressant? You have neurons that release serotonin into that synaptic cleft. And again, as I said in the beginning, once it is released, there's a burst, and then the serotonin needs to be removed from that cleft. That's how the messaging system has a crispness to it. What an SSRI antidepressant do, it blocks the normal reuptake of serotonin into the presynaptic neuron. Serotonin stays longer in the gap than normal, so it's theoretically upping serotonergic activity. Now, what your brain's going to do in response, it's going to try to dial down its own serotonergic machinery. You're going to see the serotonergic neuron release less serotonin. You're going to see the postsynaptic neuron decrease the density of its receptor sites. And so this is a way to envision the mechanism of action. The drugs perturb some normal functioning, and then the brain tries to compensate for that. It goes through these adaptations. And just so you know, you can see that this is not Bob Whitaker speaking. In 1996, Stephen Hyman, former director of the NIMH, said, here's how we should think about psychiatric drugs. They create perturbations in neurotransmitter function, that's blocking either the uptake process or the dopamine receptors. In response, the brain goes through a series of adaptations, quote, in order to maintain their equilibrium in the face of these alterations. The chronic administration can then cause substantial and long-lasting alterations in neural function. You're changing the brain, you're not normalizing the brain. And now look at what his conclusion is. After a few weeks, the person's brain is now functioning in a manner that is qualitatively as well as quantitatively different from the normal state. So if we think about psychotropic drugs, they are not normalizing agents, they're abnormalizing agents. And I think once you conceive of it in that way, you can think of two things. One, you can see why they may be problematic over the long term. And two, you can understand also now why going off the drugs can be so difficult, because your brain has gotten used to the presence of the drug, okay? So I'm going to go real quickly over the long-term effects of psychiatric drugs, antipsychotics, antidepressants. It's going to be quick. And one of the reasons I wanted to do antipsychotics in particular is because we often think, oh, there's an opportunity to go off antidepressants. There's an opportunity to go off benzodiazepines, but antipsychotics, though, people have to stay on those. And what I want to show you is the research literature shows quite clearly that if people can get off antipsychotics, they have a much higher chance of having recovering a full, robust life, okay? Now, the best study of long-term effects of antipsychotics was done by Martin Harrow and Thomas Jobe. It started in they started the study in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And what they did is they enrolled 200 psychotic patients into their study. 64 were eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia. At the end of 15 years, they still had 145 patients in the study. 64 with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, 81 with a diagnosis of mild disorders. And you can see that here. And here's what's important. They studied these people from early onset, like half of them basically first hospitalization, another 20% second hospitalization. So we're going to see how their clinical course evolves over time. Now, I will tell you, and what they're going to do is everyone's going to be treated. Everyone was treated conventionally in the hospital with antipsychotics. Then they were discharged, and then Harrow and Jobe just followed up with them at 2 years, 4.5 years, 7.5 years, 10, 15, and eventually 20. And at each follow-up, they just wanted to see how were they functioning? What was their anxiety symptoms, their cognitive functions, their psychotic symptoms, their work history, et cetera. And they're going to look and see if people are taking the antipsychotic medication or not. And actually, their hypothesis when they started this study was that those who were medication compliant and stayed on antipsychotics would have better outcomes, which was consistent with the conventional narrative, okay? But here's what they start to find. They start to find that, and this now is in the 64 schizophrenia patients, okay? And this is their data from their 15-year follow-up, or 20-year follow-up in this case. They found that among the schizophrenia patients, those diagnosed with schizophrenia, 25 of the 64 were basically off antipsychotics by year 2. And when they got off, they were still struggling, okay? You're going to see they had psychotic symptoms, they were anxious, et cetera. But now watch what happens between year 2 and 4.5, how the fates of those who get off diverge from those who stay on. First of all, you see this incredible diminishment in anxiety, whereas those on the medication stay highly anxious. Cognitive function becomes better at every follow-up for those off medication. By the way, there's a new research study out that says that cognitive function actually is impaired in the early stages as well. Now, here is one of the, so I haven't got this slide out. They have a slide in which they just look at each time those on antipsychotics and those off antipsychotics, and at each time it's those on antipsychotics who are more likely to be actively psychotic. So then they said to themselves this, let's look at the people who got off by year 2 and stayed off for the rest of the time. And let's compare that to people who were medication compliant throughout the study. The medication compliant patients being, in essence, those who would be expected to have the best outcomes. Okay, that's what we're told all the time. You have to stay on these medications. And these are schizophrenia patients. Okay, and what do you see? You see, and here's the opportunity, you see that at year 2, those who've gotten off antipsychotics are still psychotic, at least 2/3 of them. It's not that they got better on the drugs and then went off, they're still psychotic, or many of them. But look what happens from year 2 to 4.5. There's this great decrease in psychotic symptoms. And you see that those who got stable remain stable throughout pretty much the 20 years. And then look what happens to those who were medication compliant. They had high levels of psychotic symptoms at every follow-up, okay? This completely belies our usual understanding of why people so diagnosed need to be on antipsychotics. And really what the story behind this is, there's evidence that antipsychotics, because they cause that dopamine, that increase in receptors, actually increases the biological vulnerability to psychotic symptoms. Now look at this. Look at the work history of those who got off. And by the way, what happened to those who got off is they disappeared from treatment. Those who got off didn't continue to see psychiatrists. They dropped out of treatment. So the psychiatrists didn't see these that dropped out and did well. And this is the beauty of this thing, is they followed these people outside of treatment, and they found people really getting their lives back. There was someone who became a lawyer, someone who became a professor, others became teachers. Almost 90% returned to work. We never hear that as part of that conventional narrative. And so this is to be in recovery, you had to be asymptomatic, you had to be working or in school full time, and you had to have a decent social life. You'll see the recovery rate was 8 times higher for those off antipsychotics. They also looked at the global adjustment of those with milder psychotic disorders. It was better for those who off. And by the way, these are really good composite outcomes for those off with the milder disorders, really coming up by year 4.5. Okay, so this is speaking of the opportunity for people in essence to have had a time of psychosis, but if they can get off and get stable, they have every likelihood of returning to work, and basically of having had a time of schizophrenia as opposed to becoming chronically ill. Now, real quickly, so that was the US study, but there have been now many studies that looked at recovery rates for first episode patients, psychotic patients, and each time what you find is much higher functional recovery for those off medication. This is Australia's first episode study. And by the way, look at those who are taking medication regularly. They're not having functional recoveries. This was actually a drug withdrawal study, by the way, in which people who got first episode patients, this is from the Netherlands, they got stable on antipsychotics, and then they were either randomized to a tapering arm or to a drug maintenance arm. There was a period of time when it stayed like that, and then over the longer period of time, it became a naturalistic study, and even people who were randomized to drug could go off. So I just looked at the study. By the way, the group that was randomized to tapering had better 7-year outcomes, higher recovery rates, et cetera. But here's just looking at medication use at 7 years. You'll see those either down to a very low dose or off drugs, high levels of symptom remission, high levels of functional remission, and over half in full recovery. This is a study in Denmark. It's a 10-year study. You'll see, now these are actually pretty good outcomes even for those on antipsychotics, but you'll see much higher remission rates for those off at the end of 10 years, much higher employment rates. This is the UK study of first episode psychosis. At 10 years, they have data on 228 patients. Look at the recovery rate for those who got off medication, 71%. This is the opportunity you can see if we support people who have a first episode of psychosis and help them at some point, support them to get off. So that's it for the quick review of antipsychotic studies. But I hope you see and hear, what you see is if people can get off and get stable, there's a chance for like a full recovery. And you just don't see that nearly so often in people who follow the standard of care and remain medication compliant over time. And the reason I wanted to show you, we have studies from the UK, the US, Australia, and there's even more, Finland, Germany, et cetera. And they're all telling us the same thing, that for people who can successfully get off antipsychotics, who had a diagnosis of either schizophrenia or some other psychotic disorder, there's a real opportunity to get a full life back, a robust life back. Now, depression, I'll do it real quickly. It's really important to understand that prior to the arrival of antidepressants, depression, and this came from studies of people hospitalized for depression, people who were severely depressed, it was an understanding it was going to be an episodic, it ran an episodic course. And if you look at going back before antidepressants, so people hospitalized for a first episode of depression, what you'd find is this. By the end of 10 months, about 85% would be discharged, and at least half would never come back in the hospital again for an episode of depression. Okay, and so what did the NIMH tell patients in 1969 before antidepressants became so common? Assurance can be given to a patient and to his families that subsequent episodes of illness after a first mania or even a first depression will not tend towards a more chronic course. The idea with antidepressants when it first came in, by the way, was just try to shorten that period, that episode. There was no thought that we're going to remain on antidepressants because it will remit naturally, was the understanding. Yet very shortly after the introduction of antidepressants, you start getting people saying, clinicians saying, well, maybe my patients are getting better faster now, but it seems like they're relapsing much more frequently. It seems like the use of the drugs is turning depression into a more chronic course. There was a study done by a doctor in the Netherlands. He said, yeah, that's what's happening. I can compare my patients I treat without drugs with those with antidepressants. The antidepressants tend to relapse more. Now, in 1985, the National Institute of Mental Health, that's our big agency in the United States for assessment for mental health, doing research, et cetera. They noticed now that depression was running a chronic course. So they had a conference. What's going on? Now, what they said is, oh, our new studies are better than the old epidemiological studies, and we're now seeing that depression runs a chronic course. But what they didn't note is a chronic course in medicated patients. But you see in this data that there's an acknowledgement that the course of depression has now changed. So this is a really interesting study. In the 1990s, the NIMH says, well, we don't really know the course of unmedicated depression. And so let's do a study where we withdraw people who've had a first episode, okay, and then let's not put them back on an antidepressant if they relapse. And let's just see what happens over a course of a year. And what do you see? After the withdrawal, 23%, only 23% are better. They're depressed, they're probably having withdrawal symptoms, et cetera. But look what happens. 6 months, 67. 12 months, 85% are now better. This tells of the opportunity from a structured withdrawal program. Now, the NIMH also did a big study about what happens with medicated depression today. This was the largest trial ever conducted, antidepressant trial ever conducted. And when the NIMH conducted it, they said, these findings are going to govern clinical care. And what we're going to do is we're going to give people, if they don't respond to the first antidepressant, we'll give them a second antidepressant. If they don't respond to a second, we'll give them a third one. We're going to give them multiple chances to remit. And then if they do remit, if they do get better, we're going to give them the best clinical care we have for the follow-up year. And we expect that this will show we, with our treatment, can keep most people well. That's the expectation of this study. And now, by the way, these were outpatients. These were not severely hospitalized patients, okay? So there were 4,000 patients enrolled. Only 1,518 ever remitted. In other words, they had enough of a response to be seen as in remission, although actually many still had low-level depressive symptoms. Now, those that remitted were wished into this follow-up trial. And at the end of 1 year, this was the moment where the study was supposed to show that regular care with antidepressants could be so effective, there were only 108 people who were still in the trial and hadn't either dropped out or, okay, everyone else either never remitted, dropped out, or relapsed after remission. So in other words, the stay well rate, the documented stay well rate at the end of 1 year was 3%. And if we go back to what the stay well rate was, even in hospitalized patients before the advent of antidepressants, it was about 85% were well at the end of 1 year. So this is a tale of research showing that unfortunately, antidepressants increase the chronicity of symptoms. This was another study by the NIMH that wanted to look about functional outcomes between those who decided to take an antidepressant versus those who did not. You'll see that those who got treated were 3 times as likely to have a cessation of role functioning, meaning they had to quit work, that sort of thing, or actually even they weren't so good in a domestic role in the house. And the percentage that went on to disability was 7 times higher for the treated group. And I'm just going to real quickly, these are studies that try to understand the course of depression for those who stayed on medication versus those who did not. 5-year outcomes in Canada, though those who stayed on were depressed twice as much each year than those who got off. Now, this was a really interesting study. This was a study done by the World Health Organization where they sent investigators to clinics, primary care clinics in 15 cities around the world. And the purpose of this study was to show the value of screening for depression. Because what they expected to show was that those who got diagnosed by the primary care physician and treated with antidepressants would have much better outcomes than those who, in fact, in the screening by the investigators had depression, but weren't diagnosed with such by the primary care and didn't get treated for it, okay? And what they found is those who got diagnosed and treated with antidepressants, 50% were still depressed at the end of 1 year. Those who weren't diagnosed and then weren't treated with drugs, 28% were depressed at the end of 1 year. And those who were diagnosed and not treated with drugs, only 25%. So again, the chronicity was, or the ongoing depression was twice as high for the medicated group. And here's what you see in terms of the course. So if you look at the symptoms, severity of symptoms between those diagnosed with antidepressants and diagnosed no drugs, so they've both been diagnosed, there's very little difference in the baseline scales. And you see that both do improve for 3 months, and then you'll see what happens. The medicated group stops improving while the unmedicated group keeps on improving. So here you have a time chart that shows how staying on the medications actually shifts the long-term course. I know I need to quit here really quickly, so we have time for questions. This was a study that expected to find, funded by the NIMH, that you'd have the best outcomes if you combined an antidepressant with exercise, the two together. So they have 3 groups. They have Zoloft alone, Zoloft plus exercise, and exercise alone. Now, at the end of, in this particular study, it was an older group. At the end of 4 months, actually all 4 groups are doing pretty well in terms of remission, right? 69%, there's very little difference. But now watch the relapse rate in the next 6 months. Zoloft alone, 38%. In other words, they stay on the drug. Zoloft per exercise, 31%. Exercise alone, 8%. What do you see there? You see that the presence of the drug long-term is actually increasing the relapse rate compared to those with an exercise alone group. And at the end of 10 months, exercise alone, 30% were depressed. Zoloft plus exercise, 55%. In other words, the presence of the drug was like it worsened the long-term recovery rate. It was a drag on the recovery rate. So rather than the two combining for better outcomes, you see that the drug was a negative over the course of, at the end of 10 months. There's been a couple long-term studies now looking even 9 years. This is one from the United States. And they'll say symptoms were more sharply elevated 9 years following treatment, including medication and treatment without medication. In other words, even over, we had been doing over a year, now looking at 9 years. This pattern suggests possible long-term iatrogenic effects of antidepressants. Iatrogenic means treatment caused. For example, watch this, antidepressant medication may recruit processes that oppose and eventually overwhelm short-term benefits. That's that compensatory adaptations, resulting in loss of efficacy, resistant to retreatment, paradoxical effects, and withdrawal syndromes. By the way, 40% of people now who take an antidepressant apparently become treatment resistant, which you didn't used to see. But that's an example of what they're talking about here with these recruiting processes that oppose, the initial effect of the drug. And it may lead to loss of efficacy, that's chronicity, resistance to retreatment, and even a worsening of symptoms, and then withdrawal syndromes when you try to come off. There was a 30-year outcome study in Switzerland, and it found that antidepressant use doubled the risk of a poor long-term outcome. And actually, this was even if you were on the drugs for any sort of longer period of time. It wasn't necessarily that you used the drugs 30 times. So what you see in both of this research is this story. The drugs perturb some normal functioning. Your brain goes through a compensatory adaptation. It's now operating in a manner that is qualitatively and quantitatively different. And in that new state, you see greater chronicity of symptoms that the drug is supposed to treat. So for example, the psychotic patients, more psychotic symptoms. You see more functional impairment, and you see that with antidepressants too. And if we were to get into bipolar disorder, you'll see that bipolar disorder runs a much more chronic course than it used to. When they did a study of stimulants in youth, at the end of 3 years, being on a stimulant was a marker of deterioration, not a benefit. At 6 years, there was more functional impairment, more ADHD symptoms, more delinquency in the medicated kids. So you see this story over and over again. And as researchers, away from the public view, try to understand this switch to more chronic courses, here's what they say. Now, this is about antidepressants, but this idea of drug-induced oppositional tolerance, that's the compensatory adaptations, actually applies to all psychotropic drugs. That's what you saw in Stephen Hyman's comment about how they affect the brain. So when we prolong treatment more than 6 to 9 months, we may recruit processes that oppose the initial acute effects of antidepressant drugs. That's the loss of clinical effects. We may also propel the illness to a malignant and treatment unresponsive course that may take the form of resistance or episode acceleration. You're going to be more chronically depressed. And then here's the second part, which is the discouraging part. When drug treatment ends, these processes may be unopposed and yield withdrawal symptoms and increased vulnerability to relapse. And the way to understand it is this. Let's go back to the antipsychotics. Antipsychotics act as a brake on dopamine transmission. In response, your brain puts down the accelerator. Now remove the brake. You have this abnormal, the brain is now in what they call a dopamine supersensitive state, which can lead to withdrawal symptoms and a period of increased risk of relapse or return of psychotic symptoms, and symptoms more severe than they would have normally had in the normal course of the illness. With antidepressants are meant to up serotonergic activity, act as an accelerator. Your brain puts down the brake on its own serotonergic physiology. Now take away the accelerator, and what do you have? You now have the brake on this. Now that's the simplistic version. The truth of the matter is it's much more complex than this. And the reason it's much more complex is these neurotransmitter systems, first of all, they don't just function in the brain. The serotonergic system goes to the gut, et cetera, that sort of thing. These are main ways of the body functions. But also, these neurotransmitter systems don't function in isolation. They have feedback loops with other neurotransmitter systems. So the serotonergic system is listening to what the dopaminergic system is. And when you start altering that system, then the serotonergic system gets altered. And this is the black box. What I showed you in the beginning is a very simplistic vision of how the drug changes the brain immediately. But the changes are going to be much more profound and complex than actually in that model. And that brings us to this. Renormalization after withdrawal, how long does it take? And how do you best promote and support that process? Because that's the goal, right? The goal really is to get back to sort of what the normal functioning once was like. There's been very little research on this. And this is why we're stuck. The idea for the longest term was, okay, you'll go off your neuroleptic or you go off your antidepressant. It will leave the body, and maybe there'll be some withdrawal symptoms when it's leaving the body, but then your brain will reset. Well, there's increasing evidence that that isn't always necessarily so. And this is one of the things we need research into, and I want to focus on the opportunity, but there is concern that after time, some people the brain will not reset. We don't know how to reset it. And the evidence for this comes in a couple ways. With antipsychotics, you'll get some people develop tardive dyskinesia. Tardive dyskinesia is where you have these movement disorders and maybe the tongue is going like this. But by the way, tardive dyskinesia is also associated with some cognitive decline as well. And they have linked to that, the cause of that dyskinesia, to that increase in dopamine receptors. There's a way they can image the density of it, even in living people. And they find that tardive dyskinesia often doesn't remit even after you go off the antipsychotic. And when they've studied that, they find that it seems to be the problem is that the receptors don't reset back to normal. You still see this dopamine supersensitivity. So that's an example of why we need research into this, but it's also evidence of why, the percentage of people who end up with tardive dyskinesia goes up over time. So why really, if you have protocols like this, you try to keep the initial use down to a shorter period of time. With antidepressants, one of the markers of this, which is so sad and disheartening, is ongoing sexual dysfunction after coming off the antidepressants. It's called PSSD, post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. Now we know on antidepressants there's a high risk of sexual dysfunction of some sort with the use of SSRIs. But about 25% of people who are on SSRIs for a long period of time, when they come off, at least for a period of time, they don't regain their normal sexual function. And this is particularly true in younger people who've been placed on these drugs. And that's where it first sort of was identified by people who, let's say, were put on an SSRI when they were 12, 13, 14. And at least in the United States, they go to college and they want to participate in the sort of the sexual milieu that happens in college. And so they would try to come off their antidepressants, and they would come off, but many wouldn't regain their sexual function. And so that's a sign of this sort of persistent deficit in serotonergic functioning after some period of time. So that's the end of this. I don't want to be discouraging here. I hope everyone here will see that
I don't think so. I think it's not discouraging to know the truth and evidence. Thank you. But the problem is that I have tons of questions that I need to at least to pick up some so that you can answer in some limited time. So
I think I went 8 minutes too long. Sorry.
No, I think what you said was wonderful, and of course, as always, it's a pleasure to hear from you. But here's a question that I got. I'm sorry, but I could not have all these questions. We don't have time for this, so I will choose some. Many are alike, and I hope that you have all put your questions in the Q&A box. Just a reminder. So when someone tells us that there is a chemical imbalance in their brain and that diagnosis exists, what kind of resources can we present or cite to make points to challenge this idea, and so that we are believable and not conspiracy theorists?
Well, the best way to, and you can go on Mad in America and you can find resources like this, but the best resource is to cite the researchers themselves. So don't cite the critics, but for example, Ronald Pies, who's the former editor-in-chief of Psychiatric Times, which is the trade publication of the American Psychiatric Association, said the chemical imbalance theory was always a kind of myth, never a theory seriously propounded by well-informed psychiatrists. So that's coming from within American psychiatry. Tom Insel, the former director of the NIMH, he was the director of the NIMH from 2002 to 2015, also has a comment like this. It's an hypothesis that was raised actually going back to the 60s, and it didn't pan out. And if you want, what I can do is put together a list of, or a link to where someone has gathered all these quotations. But the most important way to counter this in a meeting with a therapist or a psychiatrist is to use the words of those who are in mainstream American biological psychiatry. And they're all saying is it didn't pan out. Stephen Hyman in 2002 said there's no evidence that a lesion in the dopamine system is a cause of schizophrenia. And in 2005, Kenneth Kendler, one of the world's leading researchers on this theory, said we have hunted for big, simple neurochemical explanations for major disorders, and we have not found them. So quote those people.
Okay, thank you. So here's a question I get, I bet you get often, but it's very interesting to hear. What do you do when your loved one is in psychotic state and we cannot control his behavior besides give drugs?
Well, this is why we need a complete remaking of the system, because you do need in those times, a vessel to contain that person. By contain, I mean provide a safe space for them. That obviously, and then, this was the whole idea was the Soteria project that goes back to the 1970s, was to take psychotic people, put them in an environment where they weren't initially medicated and have that environment be healing, but also a safe space. And that turned out to be successful. Okay, people did have their psychosis remit. There wasn't much violence, okay? It showed the possibility, and you do have Soteria projects now like springing up in Israel and that sort of thing. Open dialogue. One of the things that open dialogue did was work with psychotic patients, newly psychotic patients, but in a way that they didn't have to put most people on antipsychotics. If you look at their 5-year results coming out of Northern Finland, 67% of their first episode patients were never put on the drugs. But my answer to the question is, this is the problem. You need society to create safe spaces for people in these states. Let time take its, give time a chance to be a healing process, and not have it the burden on the family, because of course it can be extremely burdensome on the family. And one of the real tragedies is, in the research literature, it shows that psychotic states that occur after you come off an antipsychotic, especially if you come off quickly, are in fact often more severe than they used to see in the normal course of the illness. So what you're seeing sometimes when people come off families is not the normal course of the illness, but something much more severe. And that's part of the tragedy of our current paradigm of care.
Okay, another question for you. What do you think is the first thing that needs to happen in the USA? I would say in every country for the APA to change the guidelines. It's not only the APA around psychiatric drugs and mental health treatment. I would also add WHO, maybe.
Well, this is, this is the big challenge, because what happens is psychiatry's guild interests. We always blame the pharmaceutical companies. All the pharmaceutical companies give money to the psychiatrists, and that corrupts what they tell the public. But psychiatry as a profession, as a guild, what is their first line therapy? What is their first line product? It's drugs. And they have kept hidden all this long-term outcomes. They've kept hidden this worry about the drugs inducing this oppositional tolerance. And we just had a new book published by Thomas Insel. What he sets out to investigate, why are outcomes so poor? Why is the burden of mental illness increasing so much over time? Which was the very question I asked in Anatomy of an Epidemic, and I looked at the long-term outcomes, and that clearly was a factor. But does he go through any of the long-term outcomes data? No. Instead, what he says is, treatment works. We just need to keep people in treatment, and we need to provide them with more social support. Well, I couldn't agree more with the social support, but as long as you have the drugs as first-line therapies, you're not going to reorganize your social support. So I actually wrote an essay on this that was published like a week ago on Mad and Mary. You can look at it. The mere fact that Tom Insull, former director of the NIMH, was confronting our terrible outcomes, worsening early death, more suicides, more chronicity, more disability, and wouldn't write about any of the long-term studies funded by him, funded by the NIMH, shows that we can't trust psychiatry as a guild to work this information into their protocols. That's where we're at. Now, what Mad in America does is try to be a grassroots effort to make this information known. And then you do have some psychiatrists and providers saying, oh man, we need to change our way we do things. So you do see that. But unfortunately, boy, the guild is just resistant to talking about how its therapies, its drug therapies may be inducing, causing worse long-term outcomes. And I don't know how to get around that. Not as long as it has its product, its first product is prescribing of drugs. But individual psychiatrists can be different. Therapists can be different. We have to work with the individual psychiatrists. And so many of them, they don't know this data. It's not presented in the textbooks. It's not presented in the continuing education programs. So they're in the dark too. That's part of the problem. And somehow, and you know, IIPDW is doing it as well by holding this conference and making this information known. It's a grassroots effort to change things. And that's the only way. It's going to be a grassroots effort to make this information known and a demand to make it known. And that's the only way forward, I see it. Do not expect it from a top-down change.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I think that we don't have much more time, but we need to go on a break according to the schedule. Also need to say that we cannot answer any personal questions about withdrawal, how long it's gonna take, or what kind of symptoms will I have after withdrawal stuff. These are personal questions that I don't think that we can answer here now. But I think that we all get a picture, and that we can we have the resources for further reading, and let's hope for the best. Well,
yeah, it is going to be a grassroots effort, and this is part of the grassroots. So it's been a pleasure and an honor to be here. And sorry I went a little long.
No, it's always a pleasure, and I think that what you said was very important, and this kind of information that we need in order to start changing things.
Right.
Well, thank you very much.
All right, thanks everyone. It's been a pleasure being here. Ciao.
And let's go on a break now for about half an hour. Okay, thank you.